For 20 years, Iran built something into the mountains that most of the world never fully understood. An underground missile network so extensive that American intelligence didn't even have an accurate count of what was actually stored inside it. Then, in a matter of weeks, American and Israeli bombs collapsed dozens of tunnel entrances across that entire network. And what happened after that collapse turned out to be just as important as the collapse itself. Let's start with the sheer scale of what Iran had actually built before any of this began, because the numbers here are genuinely staggering. According to CNN's own investigation, cited in detailed analysis from KUA, Iran maintains roughly 30 underground missile bases constructed over decades across the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges. These facilities sit at depths of 400 to 1,500 feet into solid granite bedrock, connected by more than 100 interconnected tunnel systems. 30 seconds on what that actually means physically, because it's easy to let a number like 1,500 feet slide past without registering it. That's deeper than the tallest building in most major cities on Earth, carved directly into some of the hardest rock formations in the region, specifically so that no conventional weapon could reach the missiles stored inside, no matter how precisely it was aimed. 30 seconds on why granite specifically was such a deliberate engineering choice rather than an incidental feature of the terrain, because it's worth understanding the material science behind this decision in a bit more depth. Granite is significantly denser and more resistant to penetration than the compacted earth, sandstone, or reinforced concrete that make up the overburden at many other hardened facilities around the world. Choosing to carve these missile cities directly into granite formations specifically maximized the amount of penetration resistance available at any given depth, meaning Iran didn't just dig deep, it deliberately chose the hardest possible rock to dig into, compounding the physical challenge facing any weapon trying to reach those chambers regardless of how much explosive power that weapon carried. Here's 30 seconds on how sophisticated the design of these facilities actually was, because it wasn't just deep holes in a mountain. According to that same KUA analysis, the bases featured redundant, multiple exits, decoy entrances, specifically built to absorb enemy strikes, and mobile transporter erector launchers that could emerge from a tunnel opening, fire from a pre-surveyed position, and disappear back underground within minutes. That's an entire warfighting doctrine built around the assumption that any single entrance getting destroyed wouldn't matter, because the actual missiles and launch vehicles could simply use a different one, or wait out an entire bombing campaign safely buried under hundreds of feet of rock. 30 more seconds on why that transporter erector launcher concept specifically is so difficult to counter from the air, because it exploits one of the fundamental weaknesses of even the most advanced surveillance and strike systems, the exposure window. A mobile launcher that only needs a few minutes above ground to fire and retreat gives even the best satellite and drone coverage an extraordinarily narrow window to detect, identify, and strike it before it disappears back into the tunnel network. Multiply that challenge across 100 interconnected tunnels and dozens of possible emergence points, and you get a targeting problem that's less about raw weapons power and much more about achieving persistent, comprehensive surveillance across an enormous mountainous area, something that's genuinely difficult to sustain even with the most advanced reconnaissance assets available. Let's talk about how the war against this specific network actually began, because it opened with a strike unlike almost anything else we've covered in this entire conflict. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury on the American side, and Operation Roaring Lion on the Israeli side, according to that same detailed KUA analysis. The strikes targeted military installations, nuclear enrichment sites, and key officials, including Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the opening hours of the campaign. 30 seconds to sit with that specific detail, because assassinating a sitting supreme leader in the opening hours of a war is about as maximal an opening move as a military campaign can make. And it tells you everything about how seriously Washington and Jerusalem were treating Iran's underground missile network as an existential threat that needed to be addressed immediately and completely. 30 more seconds on why coordinating that opening strike, specifically with the launch of the broader tunnel campaign, makes sense from a purely military planning perspective, because the timing wasn't incidental. Removing the single figure with ultimate authority over Iran's entire military and nuclear apparatus in the same opening window as the assault on the underground missile network was almost certainly designed to create maximum confusion and decision-making paralysis at the exact moment Iran's forces would need clear, decisive leadership to coordinate a response. A military campaign against a target this deeply engineered depends heavily on speed and confusion working in the attacker's favor during the opening hours, before the defender has time to adapt. And striking the supreme leader directly was clearly intended to buy exactly that kind of disorienting head start. 30 more seconds on what that underground network was actually built to survive, because understanding the American targeting strategy requires understanding exactly what problem it was trying to solve. According to reporting from the Jerusalem Post, citing sources familiar with the intelligence, American planners went into this campaign already aware that hitting the deepest interior chambers directly was, in many cases, simply beyond what even the most advanced conventional weapons could achieve. So instead, the strategy focused heavily on collapsing tunnel entrances and cratering the access roads leading to them, denying Iran physical access to whatever was stored inside, rather than trying to destroy every missile through direct penetration of hundreds of feet of solid granite. Now let's get into the specific site that became the clearest case study of how this entire campaign actually played out, because it's genuinely one of the most thoroughly documented examples of underground warfare in modern military history. According to detailed analysis from Defense Security Asia, the Sophei missile complex near Isfahan was bombed roughly 20 separate times, yet continued launching missiles throughout the war. Satellite imagery from multiple commercial providers showed collapsed tunnel entrances, scorched mountain surfaces, destroyed support buildings, and extensive crater patterns across the entire region following repeated bombardment waves. Several strikes reportedly triggered major secondary explosions caused by detonating missile fuel, rocket propellant, or ammunition stores hidden within underground sections connected to the complex. 30 more seconds on what it actually means, tactically, for a facility to survive 20 separate bombing waves and still remain operational enough to launch missiles throughout that entire stretch, because it's a genuinely remarkable feat of engineering resilience. Every one of those 20 strikes represents a full mission cycle: target identification, weapons tasking, aircraft launch, weapons release, and battle damage assessment. And every single time, whatever remained functional deep inside Sophei's granite chambers was still capable enough to keep launching missiles afterward. That's not a facility that got lucky once or twice. That's a facility whose fundamental design assumptions about surviving repeated bombardment held up under 20 separate real-world tests during active combat. 30 seconds on why that phrase, bombed 20 times and still launching missiles, is such a remarkable detail on its own because it captures the entire strategic problem in a single sentence. Despite all of that repeated bombardment, all those secondary explosions, all that visible surface destruction, the deepest interior chambers buried inside the granite formations at Safed appeared to remain largely resistant to total destruction, because even the most advanced American penetrator weapons struggled to reach compartments buried multiple hundreds of meters underground. According to that same analysis, the repeated targeting of the same entrances suggested coalition planners believed operational paralysis could eventually be achieved through cumulative structural degradation, wearing the facility down strike after strike, rather than expecting any single strike to achieve total annihilation in one shot. Let's spend 30 seconds on the broader picture across other sites hit during this campaign, because Sophei wasn't an isolated case. According to CNN's own reporting, a missile base outside Isfahan saw the US and Israel conduct numerous strikes specifically to block 4 separate tunnel entrances, with at least 18 craters. Visible at just a pair of those entrances alone, an extraordinary number of munitions expended just to seal off 2 openings into the mountain. Satellite imagery also showed similar damage to entrances and access roads at a missile base north of Kermanshah, hit by what analysts described as likely strikes from heavy American munitions. Across the network, the strategy was consistent: seal the access points, destroy the roads leading to them, and trust that denying physical access would be enough to functionally disable the network even where the deepest chambers themselves survived. 30 seconds on how many total tunnel entrances that consistent strategy ended up targeting across the entire network, because the scale here helps put the eventual recovery effort in proper context. Across the 18 different sites CNN tracked in its investigation, 69 separate tunnel entrances were struck and blocked during the war. That's an enormous number of individual targeting decisions, 69 distinct access points, each requiring its own strike planning and battle damage assessment, spread across a network built specifically to make comprehensive denial this difficult to achieve in the first place. Here's 30 seconds on how the American intelligence community itself actually assessed the results of this entire campaign about a month in, because the honest answer was considerably more complicated than a simple victory narrative. According to the Jerusalem Post, citing 5 people familiar with U.S. intelligence, American officials could only determine with certainty that they had destroyed about a third of Iran's vast missile arsenal as the war approached its 1-month mark. The status of another third was described as less clear, with bombings likely having damaged, destroyed, or simply buried those missiles inside the underground tunnels and bunkers, according to 4 separate sources. That leaves a final third of Iran's entire missile arsenal essentially unaccounted for in that assessment, a genuinely significant gap in an intelligence picture, this many weeks into an active war. 30 more seconds on why the sources behind that specific assessment chose to remain anonymous, because it's worth understanding the sensitivity involved. According to the Jerusalem Post's own reporting, those sources spoke on condition of anonymity given how sensitive the underlying intelligence was. That's a meaningful detail on its own. An assessment this candid about the limits of American targeting success against Iran's missile arsenal wasn't something officials were willing to put their names behind publicly, even while they were willing to share the substance of it with reporters. That tension between wanting an honest picture available and not wanting to be personally identified, confirming the limits of American military success, runs through almost every account we've covered tonight about how this entire underground campaign actually unfolded. 30 more seconds on why that specific gap, roughly a third confirmed destroyed, a third uncertain, and a third essentially unknown, matters so much strategically because it directly undermines any narrative of total success. A war fought specifically to eliminate an underground missile threat, where the world's most sophisticated military and intelligence apparatus can only confidently confirm destroying 1 out of every 3 missiles in the target arsenal after a full month of sustained bombing, tells you just how effective decades of deliberate granite-based engineering actually turned out to be at defeating even the most advanced conventional air power available, regardless of how the broader campaign got framed in official statements at the time. Let's spend one final 30 seconds before the closing thoughts, because there's a detail about how quickly this reconstruction effort began relative to the ceasefire itself worth including here. Satellite imagery reviewed by CNN showed construction activity beginning at some sites within just days of the April 8th ceasefire taking effect, rather than after some longer waiting period to confirm the truce would actually hold. That speed suggests Iran's engineering and construction teams were likely staged and ready to begin recovery work the moment hostilities paused, rather than scrambling to organize equipment and personnel only after the ceasefire had already proven durable, another small but telling sign of just how thoroughly this entire recovery scenario had been anticipated and planned for in advance. Now, here's the part of tonight's story that I think earns real attention because it's the twist that came after the shooting mostly stopped. A ceasefire between the United States and Iran took effect on April 8, 2026. And according to CNN's reporting, since that ceasefire took hold, Iran has cleared at least 50 entry points across 18 different missile sites that had been damaged during the war. 30 seconds on how they actually did that, because the method itself is almost absurdly simple compared to the weapons used to create the damage in the first place. A CNN analysis of satellite images from Airbus Defence and Space found that 50 out of 69 blocked tunnels had been cleared using nothing more sophisticated than bulldozers and dump trucks. Let's really sit with that contrast for 30 seconds, because it's the single most important detail in this entire story. Timur Kadyshev, a senior researcher at the University of Hamburg's Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy, who studies Iran's missile program, told CNN that you have to use extremely sophisticated, extremely expensive weapons to create this kind of damage in the first place. And yet, the actual recovery process is remarkably low-tech, just bulldozers. Sit with the asymmetry in that sentence for a moment. The United States and Israel spent enormous sums, deployed some of the most advanced munitions on the planet, and accepted real operational risk to collapse these tunnel entrances. Iran reopened most of them using construction equipment you could rent at any hardware supply yard in the world. 30 more seconds on just how large that cost asymmetry actually is in practical terms, because it's worth putting real numbers on either side of that comparison. A single GBU-57 bunker buster bomb costs millions of dollars, requires a B-2 stealth bomber to deliver it, and depends on an enormous supporting infrastructure of tanker aircraft, intelligence targeting, and mission planning to actually put it on target. A bulldozer, by comparison, costs a small fraction of that, requires no specialized military training to operate, and can be purchased or rented through entirely ordinary commercial channels anywhere in the world. When the tool needed to undo months of sophisticated military targeting costs orders of magnitude less than the tool used to create the damage in the first place. That's not a sustainable strategic equation for whichever side is stuck playing the expensive role in that exchange. 30 more seconds on the specific sites where this reconstruction has been documented, because the pattern repeats itself across multiple locations rather than being a single isolated example. At the missile base outside Isfahan we discussed earlier, satellite imagery from early May showed a dump truck actively filling in the craters that had blocked 2 of the 4 tunnel entrances, while the other 2 entrances, also previously blocked, had already been reopened, with the access roads that had been destroyed by bombing fully repaved. At a base near Khomeini, imagery from mid-April showed at least 10 separate construction vehicles simultaneously working to clear a single tunnel entrance. And at the base north of Kermanshah, satellite images showed a pair of bomb tunnel entrances fully reopened, with the cratered roads leading to them already repaired well enough for vehicle traffic to resume. A level of restoration achieved in a matter of weeks, rather than the months or years such a rebuilding project might take in a less prepared, less battle-tested country. Here's 30 seconds on why Kadyshev's other comment to CNN carries so much weight, because it reframes this entire war in a single sentence. He said Iran had been preparing for exactly this kind of war for 20 years, and that the country is, in his words, very prepared. That's not hyperbole given everything else we've walked through tonight. Redundant tunnel entrances, decoy openings built specifically to absorb strikes, mobile launchers designed to minimize exposure time, and now a demonstrated ability to physically restore access using basic construction equipment within weeks of a ceasefire. All of that reflects 2 decades of deliberate planning, specifically built around the assumption that a war exactly like this one would eventually happen. 30 seconds on what those 20 years of preparation actually looked like in practice, because it wasn't simply digging tunnels and waiting. Building a network this extensive, 30 separate bases, over 100 interconnected tunnels, redundant decoy entrances, and a doctrine built around rapid mobile launcher deployment requires sustained investment across multiple governments, consistent engineering expertise passed down through successive generations of military planners, and enough patience to keep building quietly for 2 full decades without any guarantee the investment would ever actually be tested in real combat. That kind of long-horizon, multi-decade strategic patience is genuinely rare, and it's exactly the kind of investment that pays off precisely in a scenario like this one, where the payoff only becomes visible once an adversary actually tries to destroy what's been built and discovers just how difficult that turns out to be. 30 seconds on what experts believe actually remains stored inside these facilities even after everything we've covered tonight, because the numbers here are sobering. Multiple experts interviewed by CNN estimated that Iran likely still possesses around 1,000 missiles stored deep inside these underground facilities, because many of the sites sit beneath hundreds of meters of solid rock. Analysts believe the stockpiles themselves likely suffered limited direct damage from strikes that were primarily focused on the entrances and access points rather than the deep storage chambers themselves. On top of that, a New York Times report, cited separately, noted that the United States believes Iran has regained access to a majority of its missile sites, with the country retaining roughly 70% of its total mobile launcher inventory intact. 30 more seconds on why that specific 70% figure for surviving mobile launchers matters just as much as the missile stockpile numbers themselves, because a missile without a working launcher to fire it from is a far smaller threat than one paired with a functioning transporter erector launcher ready to deploy it. Retaining 70% of that launcher fleet means Iran didn't just preserve the raw munitions, it preserved the delivery mechanism needed to actually use them on short notice. Combine that surviving launcher capacity with an estimated 1,000 missiles still sitting in deep storage, and you get a picture of an underground missile force that emerged from this entire war bruised and disrupted, but nowhere close to eliminated as an operational threat. Let's spend 30 seconds on how a senior American official themselves characterized this entire recovery effort, because even Washington's own assessment doesn't try to spin this as anything other than a genuine setback. An anonymous U.S. official said Iran had exceeded all timelines for its reconstitution following the damage dealt to it by American and Israeli strikes. That's a direct acknowledgement from inside the American government itself that Iran recovered its underground missile capability significantly faster than American planners had originally projected, using nothing more advanced than the same basic construction equipment that's been clearing these tunnels since the ceasefire took effect. Here's 30 seconds on how one analyst, Sam Lair, put the entire campaign in its most honest, complete perspective, because it's a genuinely fair way to describe what actually happened here. He noted that the American military is genuinely good at delivering tactical successes, and that entombing and suppressing the Iranian missile force for a period of time was a great example of exactly that kind of tactical achievement. Notice the careful, precise language there. Tactical success, not strategic victory. That distinction is the entire story of this underground missile campaign in a single sentence. American and Israeli air power absolutely succeeded at temporarily paralyzing this network during the active war. It did not succeed at permanently eliminating the underlying threat the network represents. 30 more seconds on why that specific distinction, tactical versus strategic, actually matters for how you should think about the broader war, rather than just this one underground campaign, because the same pattern shows up whenever you zoom out. A tactical success buys time, disrupts an adversary's immediate operational tempo, and creates real short-term advantages on the battlefield. A strategic success permanently changes the underlying balance of capability between two sides. Everything we've walked through tonight, 20 separate strikes on Safi that still didn't eliminate its ability to fire, an intelligence assessment that could only confirm a third of the arsenal destroyed, and a recovery effort that restored most of the damaged access points within weeks using nothing more than bulldozers, all of it points toward the same conclusion. This was a campaign built around, and largely limited to, tactical effects, regardless of how much firepower and sophistication went into achieving them. You made it to the roundup section, and there's a piece of independent verification worth 30 seconds of your attention. because this entire story isn't relying purely on anonymous government sources. Independent open source intelligence analysts have been tracking this exact recovery process, using nothing more than publicly available satellite imagery from providers like Planet Labs, Airbus, Maxar, and the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 program. According to that Defense Security Asia analysis, this specific underground missile campaign became one of the most transparently documented underground warfare episodes ever observed through commercial satellite imagery and open source analysis, with independent researchers tracking tunnel entrance damage, excavation progress, and shifting vehicle concentrations in real time, completely separate from whatever either government chose to officially confirm. 30 seconds on how that gap between an official government account and independently confirmed satellite evidence has repeated itself throughout nearly every major episode of this war, worth remembering as a pattern rather than treating it as unique to this one underground campaign. Strikes get confirmed with varying degrees of specificity depending on how sensitive the underlying intelligence is judged to be. Recovery efforts and setbacks tend to surface weeks or months after the fact. Once independent satellite analysts have had time to compare fresh imagery against what came before, and the fullest, most complete picture of any single event in this conflict usually only comes together well after the initial headlines have already faded from public attention. That's a genuinely new feature of modern warfare, one that didn't exist even a couple of decades ago. Coordinates associated with these tunnel entrances have remained visible for years across commercial imagery platforms. According to that same analysis, transforming facilities that were once purely the subject of classified intelligence briefings into something any sufficiently motivated researcher anywhere in the world can independently monitor and verify for themselves. 30 more seconds on why that level of independent, commercially available verification matters so much for a story like this one, because it removes a lot of the usual uncertainty that comes with wartime claims from either side. When a story depends entirely on anonymous government officials speaking to reporters, there's always some healthy skepticism worth applying. But when multiple independent commercial satellite providers, unaffiliated with either government, are all capturing the same craters, the same construction vehicles, and the same reopened tunnel entrances, that's about as close to an objective, verifiable record of what actually happened on the ground as this kind of story is ever likely to get. Now, let's move into the strategic analysis, because I think this entire episode, the collapse and the recovery together, tells you something important about the actual limits of air power against a threat this deliberately engineered. What you're looking at here is a genuine mismatch between the cost and sophistication required to create damage versus the cost and sophistication required to repair it. The United States and Israel deployed some of the most expensive, most technologically advanced weapon systems on the planet to seal these tunnel entrances. Iran needed nothing more than bulldozers, dump trucks, and front-end loaders, equipment available to virtually any construction company on Earth, to undo a meaningful portion of that damage within weeks. 30 seconds on why this specific asymmetry represents such a difficult problem for military planners to actually solve, rather than simply an unfortunate but fixable oversight. Any weapon powerful enough to permanently seal a tunnel entrance beyond the reach of ordinary construction equipment would need to cause damage on a scale that risks destabilizing the surrounding mountain terrain itself, a category of destruction most military planners are understandably reluctant to pursue given the environmental and diplomatic consequences involved. That leaves entrance denial as a deliberately calibrated, moderate option, effective enough to create real short-term disruption, but never intended to be permanent in the way that a full mountain collapse might theoretically achieve. Understanding that calibration helps explain why this outcome, real disruption followed by eventual recovery, was probably always the most realistic result any strike planner could have expected going in, rather than a surprising failure of the underlying strategy. 30 more seconds on why that specific asymmetry should worry anyone thinking seriously about how future conflicts involving deeply buried infrastructure might play out, because Iran isn't the only country that studied this exact playbook. Any adversary watching this specific war unfold has just received a real-world demonstration that even the most advanced bunker-defeating weapons in the American arsenal primarily achieve access denial rather than total destruction against sufficiently deep, sufficiently hardened underground facilities, and that basic construction equipment can meaningfully restore that access faster than defenders might expect. That's a lesson in engineering and strategy that doesn't stay contained to just this one specific war. So here's where I want to leave this with you tonight. Given everything we just walked through, 20 years of deliberate underground construction, a war that collapsed dozens of tunnel entrances within weeks, and a recovery effort that reopened most of them using nothing more than construction equipment. Do you think this entire campaign should be judged as a genuine strategic failure, given how quickly and cheaply Iran reversed much of the damage? Or do you think the tactical success Sam Lair described, buying weeks or months of genuine disruption during the most intense phase of the war, was actually valuable enough on its own, regardless of how quickly the underlying capability got restored afterward? And do you think future American planning against this kind of deeply buried threat needs to shift away from targeting entrances entirely towards some other approach nobody has fully worked out yet? Or is entrance denial simply the best available option against a target this deeply engineered, regardless of how quickly an adversary can dig their way back out? I'd genuinely like to hear where you land on that, because I think there's a real defensible case on both sides of this one. 30 seconds on one more angle worth weighing before the final thought, because it's genuinely the hardest part of this entire story to resolve with confidence. Every option available against a facility, this deeply engineered, involves some kind of trade-off, more powerful penetrator weapons that risk collateral damage and still might not reach the deepest chambers, sustained blockade and denial strategies that Iran has now demonstrated it can reverse within weeks using basic equipment, or accepting that some underground capability will simply survive any conventional campaign, regardless of how it's designed. None of those options represents a clean, satisfying solution, and that's probably the most honest note to end this specific story on. Rather than pretending there's an obvious fix, nobody involved in this war has already considered and rejected for good reason. One last 30-second thought before wrapping up completely, because I think it captures the entire story better than any single statistic could. Iran didn't out-engineer the United States and Israel during this specific war. It outweighed them. 20 years of patient, deliberate construction, redundant entrances, decoy openings, granite depths specifically chosen to exceed what conventional weapons could reach, all of it was built around a simple bet that any bombing campaign, no matter how intense, would eventually end, and that basic construction equipment would still be sitting there afterward to dig the tunnels back out. That bet turned out to be exactly right, and it's probably the single most important lesson buried inside this entire episode. And that lesson extends well beyond just Iran's own specific missile program. Worth remembering the next time any story about hardened underground infrastructure comes up anywhere else in the world. Patience, redundancy, and low-tech recovery methods turned out to matter just as much as sophisticated engineering in determining how this entire campaign actually played out over the following months. A facility engineered to survive isn't just about how deep you dig or how hard the rock is. It's also about whether you've planned for the after, for what happens once the bombing eventually stops and it's time to start digging your way back out. And Iran's 20 years of preparation clearly accounted for that final unglamorous phase just as carefully as it accounted for surviving the airstrikes themselves. Thanks so much for spending this time working carefully and closely through absolutely every bit of it with me tonight. I'll keep tracking whatever additional satellite imagery and independent analysis comes out about the remaining unopened tunnel entrances. And the moment there's clearer confirmation on exactly how much of Iran's underground missile arsenal actually survived this entire campaign intact, I'll break it all down for you in just as much detail as we covered tonight. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you again very soon.